Agree. Thank you for that. Well, one area where we appear to be going to get more legislation is child protection, or maybe not. But let's start with a good day to bury bad news. And of course, most people completely missed the significance of Thursday last week because IICSA produced its final report on child abuse in UK. And this is the headline from their webpage, the report of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, released 20th October. Well, of course, this was an absolutely tremendous day to bury bad news because, in fact, over a number of days, the country had been drowning in all matters to do with leadership change of the Prime Minister and the top of the Tory party. So nobody was interested in anything to do with child sexual abuse at all. And what happened was this went up on the BBC and other websites for a brief part of that particular day. And then already this key inquiry, albeit with many weaknesses, has disappeared into the long grass. But let's just take a little bit out of the executive summary. It's a big document. It's going to take UKCOLUMN a while to get into the depths of it. But it says that this is the final statutory report published by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. In accordance with terms of reference, it set out the main findings about the extent to which state and non-state institutions failed in their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation, and it makes recommendations for reform. Now, what you get very quickly from this particular text is it identifies 13 million children in England, Wales, and it says 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 20 boys will experience abuse before the age of 16. So quite clearly, the problem in UK is immense, but it was so unimportant that it was released to be buried under the weight of Liz Truss. Common themes amongst institutions, well worth reading. The pain and suffering caused to victims and survivors often affected many aspects of their lives. And it goes on to say that the deviousness and cruelty of perpetrators was, quote, limitless. And that about sums it up. If we do a little bit more here, it says the protection of personal and institutional reputations above the protection of children was a frequent institutional reaction. And of course, that was a reaction across all institutions, be it the care system themselves or indeed government. But of course, this has been a very carefully written report that hasn't gone too heavy on government. But it did say that problems in the criminal justice system included investigative and prosecutorial failures. So there are hints as to what was going on. We haven't read the full report yet, so we've got to be a little bit careful. But I'm going to say in the executive summary, you get a feeling of shifting blame, particularly onto the Catholic and the Church of England, and the protection of people in high establishment positions, but maybe I'm biased. It goes on to talk about the experiences of children who were abused outside the UK, and it points out that this started with the child migration programs, which started in earnest immediately after the Second World War, supported by the major charities, so-called child protection charities. But if we look into this, we've got to see the real picture that the government was itself facilitating the abuse of children. Well, we will do more on this particular report because there's a lot more to talk about. But I just wanted to focus today on the utter disgrace that is the BBC, because of course, not only did the BBC bury this story as well, it also put out this interesting little audio under Stories of Our Times. And the host of this particular program was David Aaronovitch. And the headline for the piece was 10 years ago, the Jimmy Savile affair shocked the nation, sparking a moral panic about child abuse and institutional cover-ups. In response, the government launched a national inquiry in 2014. This week, after 8 years and over 180 million spent, the Independent Inquiry on Child Sexual Abuse will release its final report. Notice the future tense will release, because this BBC piece was done in preparation of the release of the report. And the particular edition was with Sean O'Neill, the chief reporter from the Times. And this is part of his quote during the piece. He gets on to the IICSA inquiry itself. He said he's been totting it up. IICSA cost 180 million at least. And then he goes on to compare it with other inquiries where they end up mocking the Edinburgh tram inquiry because it still hasn't produced a report and it's cost 13 million quid. And there's general bonhomie and laughter in what is a piece about the abuse of children. Well, this is Sean O'Neill himself. He's chief reporter of the Times, working on investigations and major stories. He was apparently awarded Scoop of the Year, a News Reporter of the Year at the 2019 British Press Awards after exposing the scandal of, quote, sexual misconduct by Oxfam aid workers in Haiti. I thought it was a bit of a shame that he didn't seem to get that award for exposing the abuse of children in the UK, but obviously Haiti was his focus. Let's listen to the first of a couple of clips from this audio programme to get a feel for how the BBC, nay the Times, decided to approach their look at the inquiry.
The following podcast has been acquired by the BBC as part of a trial. It is not complied by BBC editorial standards, but covered by Section 2 of the Ofcom Broadcasting Code.
Before we begin, this episode contains reference to child sexual abuse from the very start. This time, 10 years ago, one story above all appalled the country.
The police currently have 8 formal allegations against Sir Jimmy Savile, 2 of rape and 6 of indecent assault. But they say information is coming in all the time.
The Savile affair was a symbol of how some of our best-known institutions had, over the years, turned a blind eye to, or even worse, covered up abuse.
The culture of the BBC certainly enabled both Savile and Stuart Hall to go undetected for decades.
At Stoke Mandeville and Leeds General, Jimmy Savile was given a bedroom and an office. At Broadmoor, Britain's high-security psychiatric hospital, he got his own set of keys.
Under pressure to act, the authorities pursued a string of accusations against celebrities accused of child sexual abuse. Some were hard to credit, but true.
From Rolf Harris, there were no words, no reaction, and no apology.
As Gary Glitter arrived for sentencing today, gone were both the glamour and the rock.
And soon the accusations began to be made against people who were or had been at the very heart of power.
We know that some of the abusers are alleged to be senior military personnel, also law enforcement people, and senior politicians.
But by now, this outrage was morphing into a moral panic fueled by a media feeding frenzy, which was itself fed by conspiracy theories.
Throwing into doubt virtually every institution in the country, and the kind of almost air of hysteria now.
Of course they should have called me, and I would have told them exactly what they learnt later on, that it was complete rubbish.
Out of that crucible of genuine alarm and sometimes false accusation grew a national inquiry which on Thursday, 8 years and over £180 million later, will publish its final report.
So David, come over to you very quickly before we move on with another little bit of the clip, but the BBC sets the scene by mentioning itself in relation to child abuse fleetingly, and then it introduces the words of moral panic, conspiracy, hysteria, and rubbish.
Yes, and essentially acquits itself in the process. And I see that David Aaronovitch is tweeting today, the child abuse inquiry won't say the thing that's true, that the great Westminster pedo scandal was a classic moral panic led by liars and fantasists. He's writing this in the Times. So he's absolutely clear that this did not happen. This is a narrative that's coming out, despite the truly horrendous and vast amounts of information provided to the IICSA inquiry.
That's exactly how I see it, David. Now, I have edited some little bits of this clip to bring things together, make that very clear, encourage people to go and listen to the full clip. Let's have a listen to this second little section to get a feel for what's happening.
And the problem with Carl Beech's story was that it was a complete lie from start to finish. He had fabricated this story, and the investigation found nothing to corroborate anything Beech had said. It was then turned into an investigation into Carl Beech himself and his perversion of the course of justice, which uncovered the fact that he'd had a lot of child abuse images on his computer. And Beech, in the end, went on trial, was jailed, and Operation Midland collapsed. And if you were sitting in the inquiry room, as I was sometimes, you were thinking, how does this inquiry conduct itself now when the catalyst for setting it up is proven to be a lie?
And yet it did, and it continued. Did Dame Lowell Goddard last very long?
No, around the time the police investigation was collapsing, Lowell Goddard's credibility was collapsing as well. There was a quite notorious hearing where she asked for help with the local law, and there was this kind of disbelief that she hadn't got her head around basics of the legal process, and she was the chair of the inquiry. And then we revealed in the Times that she'd spent most of the previous year not in London but back home in New Zealand. And then behind the scenes, while that was being exposed, her panel of experts that she was working with were going to the Home Office saying they had real concerns about her ability to run the inquiry. And very suddenly, in the middle of 2016, she resigned, and they were without a chair once again.
Right, so who did they get? Coming up, IICSA is under new management, and not even the royal family or the Vatican will escape its scrutiny. That's after a quick message from a colleague.
I'm Kat Lay, health editor at The Times. Our health coverage spans everything from how the way we live can raise or lower our risk of diseases, to advances in medical treatment, to the problems facing the NHS and their potential solutions. We can only do this thanks to the subscribers of The Times and Sunday Times.
So, David, this is a piece on child abuse, and I hope the audience picked up the snickering and the laughter, because this is a feature of this particular piece. But it's also let's make money for the Times and put an advert in the middle of it. This is an utter disgrace. Words fail me.
Are you sure it was about child abuse, Brian? Because it sounded like a sitcom to me.
It's not about child abuse. It's about mocking the inquiry and everything to do with the inquiry and making money in adverts for the Times. And notice the disclaimer at the beginning of the piece, which said, no, this hasn't been produced by the BBC. It's part of an experiment. I think this piece is so disgraceful. I've got one more short clip, but I'm going to encourage people to listen to the full piece. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a lot of people complaining about the standard of this particular programme to the BBC? Let's just have a listen of the last part 3.
It was Ball who was the evil character in this story. I think because he was an establishment figure and he had friends in high places, he manipulated those people to try and defend himself.
Now, while the inquiry knocked the idea of a Westminster paedophile ring on the head, that doesn't mean that it didn't point to some instances of politicians being involved.
There was an investigation strand into Westminster, and it looked at a number of quite extraordinary cases, including Sir Peter Hayman, former spy chief, who had been caught with obscene material and managed to escape any serious punishment. But I was really struck by the case of Peter Morrison. Peter Morrison was a Conservative MP, a drunk, and he's dead now. and was known by the whips in his own party to have, as they put it in one quote, a penchant for small boys. MI5 were aware of this. They were aware that when Morrison was a minister and might be going overseas, that he might be vulnerable to blackmail, particularly by the KGB in the 1980s. And the MI5 wrote memos warning Thatcher about Sir Peter Morrison's interest in children. Thatcher didn't want to know. She later promoted Morrison to be her PPS. And an MI5 witness told the inquiry, if the Prime Minister knew of the allegations, was not particularly, on the face of it, concerned about them, if this is a true account of the situation, then there would be little point in MI5 investigating them further. So Morrison was let off the hook and never really pursued.
In terms of its recommendations in previous bits of the report, are any of them of significance?
I spoke to someone the other day who was involved in the very first investigation, which was the forced child migration after the Second World War, where children of single mothers and children from poor families were swept up and sent off to farm schools in Australia and schools in Canada, and many of them suffered appalling physical and sexual abuse.
So, David, just to bounce this off you, I listened at the start to them mocking the idea of a Westminster-based paedophile ring, and yet in the part we've just heard, what they're effectively is describing a network that was protecting people who were abusing children. It also included the security services. Apparently, this is all fantasy, but they're describing it.
Yes, and they're picking one or two names, and we know there are many, many more that have been exposed and after their death, and against whom there are huge volumes of evidence, including, of course, Ted Heath, former Prime Minister.
Indeed, and I'll just leave our viewers with this short video clip, which of course is the BBC with an interview of one of Heath's whips, Tim Fortescue. Consider what this man says in a very short clip against the laughter and frivolity of Aaronovitch in that disgraceful interview with Neil from the Times. Let's listen to what the BBC reported several years ago.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, no, I'm in a jam. Can you help? It might be debt, it might be scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help. And if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can, because we would store up brownie points. That sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons. Is if we can get a chap out of trouble, then he'll do as we ask forevermore.
Well, that says it all. That's the situation. We will have a look at the depth of the IICSA inquiry, but of course we can also say to the audience with confidence that not only were witnesses refused the opportunity to speak at the IICSA inquiry, that evidence from qualified professionals, including police, was withheld and or heavily redacted to make sure the real truth of what was happening with the child abuse did not reach public ears.
So there's plenty to criticise the IICSA inquiry about, but it's not a laughing matter.
It's not a laughing matter, no.
Okay, David, let's finish off then with a building at risk.
Yeah, building at risk, Fornethy House. This is in beautiful Glen Island near Ayleth, in the Angus Glens. And you see it's a very large, impressive, quite austere house. And the background of this is it was built as a holiday retreat in a private home, and it was then gifted by the owner, the Coates family of Paisley textile fame, to Glasgow Council, so that it could be a holiday residence for the children, for girls who came from poor families and families where they needed a bit of respite and a bit of a break. or where the girls themselves were ill and needing to get out of the smoke of industrial Glasgow to somewhere more conducive to recover. A very noble idea, and unfortunately, like so many of these, by the time you got to the 60s and 70s, it was something else entirely. So here we see the Daily Record, Fornethy House, abuse survivors call for independent inquiry. We're still begging for inquiries into these things. Into Scott's all-girls school, House of Horrors. 200 victims so far, by the way. 200 victims have claimed they suffered mental, physical and sexual abuse at the hands of staff between 1960s and 1980s. They formed a Fornethy Survivors Group, and they've come forward to say they were beaten, humiliated, force-fed, sexually assaulted at the hands of staff during their terms at the converted mansion. Many of the victims attended the school in their primary years and have been left with lifelong physical and mental health issues. Now, this particular building saw, because it was a short-term holiday periods that the girls were going in for, it was seeing something like 700 girls a year. So, and it was going for a couple of decades. So we've got 200 victims so far. Who knows how many there are? Now they are standing together and they are providing support for one another and getting their message out. Here we see the Glasgow Times reporting on a demonstration they held in George Square in Glasgow, calling for justice for all Abernethy abuse survivors. The Times reports Fornethy House survivors take to Glasgow's George Square and calls for justice. A woman said, "It's very emotional, but it's very healing because as a child you were silenced. And we've all got a little girl inside of us that suffered and was silenced. Meeting these women today allows us to be heard, and that validates that the traumas we've suffered were real and that we're no longer alone. We're now being heard, we are together and nobody can silence us." Well, let's hope that's the case. IICSA and the Scottish equivalent might suggest otherwise. The Courier here reports the first civil case lodged by one of the victims here. A woman who claims she was abused while attending a residential school in rural Angus has lodged a civil court case to seek justice for the trauma she says she suffered. This is the first of the 200 alleged victims and is being treated as a test case. Now, this was raised in the Scottish Parliament by Colin Smith, Labour MSP, who wrote, "My constituent Marion Reid, has come to Parliament today along with other survivors of Fornethy House residential school to highlight the plight. So far, 200 brave women have come forward. I suspect that this is the tip of the iceberg, and shared a traumatic, awful experience of physical, mental and sexual abuse at the hands of staff in Fornethy in the 1960s, where young, vulnerable children were sent supposedly to help them recover from illness. Understandably, those women feel that no one is listening to them. The Deputy First Minister has said he will meet them. Can I ask him to ensure that the meeting takes place urgently? More importantly, will he ensure that he and the government listen to these women and that no stone is left unturned to get answers for them and that the perpetrators are brought to justice?" Deputy First Minister, of course, is John Swinney, who we know well. John Swinney was the man who single-handedly forced the head of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, Susan O'Brien QC, out of her post, and she cited very clearly political pressure from John Swinney as the reason she had to leave. So that John Swinney replied, "There are a couple of different issues in that question. Mr. Smith's last point was whether every effort could be made to ensure the perpetrators of abuse are brought to justice. Properly, this is a matter for Police Scotland and the Crown. It's not a matter, it's a process that's independent of government." Oh yes. The substance of the issue around Fornethy is very sensitive. I've agreed to meet with a group of survivors, I think, in response to a parliamentary question from Monica Lennon. I will do that as soon as possible. I applaud the courage of individuals who have come forward, and I know that the concern is the redress arrangements that the Parliament has put in place do not automatically include individuals who were in Fornethy for a short period of time, because it is primarily focused on individuals who were abused during long-term care placements. To Mr. Smith and his constituent, I say there's obvious scope for individuals to apply for Redress Scotland for redress payment, and each individual circumstance will be individually addressed and assessed. It is not the case that there's a prohibition on applications from Fornethy survivors. Is that each case will be addressed individually on its merits. Again, I will happily see the group and will do so as soon as I possibly can. Now, I understand that that meeting has now taken place and that the group are, shall we say, unimpressed with the results, but I'll try and get more on that for another news. I would simply point out to anyone who's in the Fornethy survivor group that they should have a look at a UKCOLUMN article called Corrupt Scotland, John Swinney and the Crown Office, which details one of Mr. Swinney's particular exploits, which was of concern to us in terms of corruption of high government positions. And we concluded that we had 4 questions that were unanswered at that point. They are unanswered still. The questions were, does Frank Mulholland, now Judge Lord Mulholland, make a habit of interfering with court cases and tampering with witness lists? We still don't know. Does John Swinney, or for that matter Nicola Sturgeon, or any other Scottish Cabinet Minister, routinely use the Lord Advocate to influence the conduct of court cases, which they feel to be inconvenient, bothersome, or personally threatening? We still don't know the answer to that either. We asked what are the relationships between the present and previous Lord's Advocate and the Scottish National Party administration? How close is it? Is there any separation of powers at all? We still don't know. And finally, we asked just how corrupt is Scottish public life? We don't know that one either.